you can count on Adrienne. With Adrienne Hill.
Hello, everyone. This is Adrienne Hill from Skookum Studios in Calgary, Alberta. And today I have a really special guest with me. I have Dr. Christopher Labos. And according to his bio on the McGill Office for Science and Society, he spends most of his time doing things that he doesn't get paid for, like doing research, teaching, and podcasting. And occasionally he finds time to practice as a cardiologist so he can pay his rent. And he writes, of course, for the McGill Office for Science and Society, and now has written a book. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
We will be talking about your book. It's called Does Coffee Cause Cancer? And 8 More Myths About the Food We Eat. But before we talk about the book, I need to find out a little bit more about you. I'd like to know how you got into science, when you became first interested in science, and eventually science communication.
So, I am a medical doctor. So how I got interested in science was through the practice of medicine. But the way it sort of happened was sort of interesting. I did my medical training and all my clinical training in cardiology. But then part of being an academic-ish person is you have to be able to do research. And what I found was that I didn't really have the skills to do research properly. Now, there's different types of research. Obviously, you can do bench research, you can do clinical research, but to do population epi-level research, which is kind of what I was interested in, I didn't really have the foundations for that. So after my medical training, I went to do a master's degree in epidemiology. And that's really where I became exposed to a lot of the issues and a lot of the problems with the published literature. And that's when I first heard of people like John Ioannidis, who was, of course, one of the big names in epidemiology, became a bit of a controversial figure during COVID for a lot of the things that he did and wrote and said. But that's sort of a story for another day. But at the time, his work about why the medical research was so problematic really sort of opened my eyes. And I was sitting in epidemiology class with a friend of mine, and there was this article popped up in the local paper, and it was about how strawberries could be used to prevent heart disease in women. And we had really just learned what the problem with that type of research is, which is when the benefits are so small, it takes an excessive amount of treatment to prevent one disease. So I wrote this article to sort of explain this to people, and I didn't really know what to do with it. And a friend of mine said, well, just send it as a letter to the editor, to the newspaper. And I was like, well, they just publish anything? Somebody read, they're like, yeah, you just send a letter to the editor and they will publish it. That's how newspapers work. And I was like, oh, okay. So I sent them a letter and explaining number needed to treat. And I sort of said, he's like, it's going to take you have to force feed 87,000 women strawberries every day for 2 years to prevent one non-fatal heart attack. And so that was sort of the thesis of the article. And so they sent me back an email and said, pretty good. Cut out 3,000 words and then we'll publish it in the newspaper. and I was like, cool. And then I wrote that. And then I was like, can I write you guys another letter to the editor? And they were like, yeah, knock your socks off. And so I started writing newspaper articles, and then the newspaper articles became radio interviews, and then the radio interviews became TV interviews. And then when COVID happened, I became, one of the physicians that was trying to explain COVID, and having that epidemiological background to explain test sensitivity and specificity and all that became really important. And a lot of that also became dispelling a lot of the myths that were surrounding COVID. And,
right.
I was doing all of that. And then I thought to myself, well, I really just have too much free time on my hands. And I said, let me write a book as well. And so that's how that whole sort of process started. It really was a stepwise process where I became more and more involved in the field.
And the strawberry story is in the book, actually.
It is in the book. Yeah, it's one of the, yes, it is in the book as well.
And what school did you actually go to medical school? What universities did you attend?
Oh, yeah. I was at McGill. I did my medical school at McGill and my clinical training at McGill, so my residency as well. The master's degree I also did at McGill. I then spent a few years in Toronto doing research and sort of seeing patients on the side just to help out a little bit. And then I ended up coming back to Montreal kind of just before COVID happened, to be honest with you. I'm trying to remember the details. I think it was probably sometime in 2019. I can't remember exactly, but it was sort of interesting. Sometimes I think to myself, what would have happened if I had still been in Toronto when this had happened and the lockdowns had started? Would I have been would I be living in Toronto right now? But no, I did my whole medical training at McGill, and now I'm back in Montreal and sort of teaching and doing sort of stuff on the side and helping out with research. And it's very interesting because I do a bunch of different stuff, which is I'm seeing my patients. I'm doing research in like preeclampsia and like vascular stuff in pregnancy, which is radically different from how I spend most of my other time. And then most of my other time is spent, doing public science communication, largely through traditional media outlets, which is not something that a lot of other people in the psychom or skepticism field tend to do. So I sort of approach it from a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, because you're on CBC Radio, CBC Television, not going to something like Skeptical Inquirer, which is sort of the normal.
Yeah, normal thing. And I've sort of wondered, like, oh, should I try to do that? And then you sort of have to remind yourself not to spread yourself too thin.
Yes.
And it's always a challenge because, there is a tendency to want to poo-poo traditional media and say traditional media is dying, but it really isn't. It's still there. Hmm. And I mean, even on its worst days, it still has a massive audience. Where I think it becomes a little bit challenging is you don't have the feedback that you would from your own platform, right? So if you're on Twitter, I guess now X, if you're on Facebook, if you have your own Substack, you're seeing the engagement in real time. Whereas, when I'm doing my regular stuff with CBC TV on Monday mornings, I mean, it's national TV. I assume there's a lot of people watching, but I have no idea.
Right.
It's very hard is that if you need that feedback to know that you're making a difference, you don't really get it. So you sort of you're screaming into the void and you hope that people listen. And I think they do, because every so often you do get these messages and this feedback. So it's a slightly different way to go about it, and not sort of, I realize, the traditional way that most people do SciComm to the general public.
But it's needed in all places, I think.
That's right. And we forget that a lot of the population still watches traditional media, right? They still listen to the radio, especially local. We sometimes forget how important the local media is to where you are. And so I'm in Montreal. I do a lot of stuff here in Montreal. But, if you're in Calgary, for example, or we forget how important the local media is to people. And so the advice I often tell people is like, well, how do I get started in this? I'm like, honestly, the first and most important thing you should do is contact your local outlets. They may need the science person, and they would be happy to have you to sort of explain stuff to the public. And you reach a lot of people that way, even if it isn't the more glamorous thing of saying that you have like a regular syndicated column and having, thousands and thousands of followers on Twitter/X.
And you mentioned that you're on a podcast, and I know Jonathan Jerry has been on this show on the Skeptic Zone a couple times. How did you meet Jonathan, and how did you decide to come up with the podcast idea?
So I often like to joke that, we served in the military together and we've known each other for years. No, the truth is, people sometimes ask us like, oh, you guys have been like childhood friends forever. And you're like, no. The way it actually happened was about 9 years ago now. Jonathan was doing his other previous podcast. I'm 99% sure it was called Cracked Science. I'm pretty sure that's right. And so he contacted me and said, do you want to be interviewed for my podcast? And I was like, who is this guy? And I looked him up. I'm like, is he a stalker? Is he going to kill me and steal my organs? And that is still a possible outcome. I don't know. This may just be a very long con on his part. But no, he was looking for a local physician to sort of criticize a lot of the alternative healthcare practices. That's what his podcast was about. It was a skeptical podcast. And so he reached out to me and I was like, okay, he's probably not an axe murderer. So I invited him over to my place. We did the interview, went well. He was doing stage shows with a few other people at that time. So I joined him for one of them. And at that point, I had actually just made my move to Toronto, if memory serves. And I was starting to because I did a journalism certificate while I was in Toronto as well. I forgot that when I was mentioning my background.
A journalism certificate.
Yeah, I did a course at the course has moved from one school of the University of Toronto to the other. It used to be at the Monk School. Now it's part of the School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And, but at the time it was part of the Monk School. And so it was a global journalism fellowship. So it was a 1-year certificate course. And I was like, well, I'm in Toronto anyways. Might as well do that. So I was getting involved with the media, and I was sort of interested in sort of developing something. But at the time, they didn't really have the bandwidth for like a regular medical segment or a show or an audiovisual thing. So I said to Jonathan, would you be interested in developing something like this? And at first he was like, no, I want nothing to do with you. We're done. But we kept talking and then he said, all right, well, let's give it a shot. So we started doing the podcast. And he sort of liked it and we got along well together. And so he eventually stopped doing his other thing and we just started doing the body of evidence. And we've been going strong for almost 9 years at this point. And, you know, the riches have been pouring in because, as you know, podcasting is extremely lucrative. I mean, the money, good God, the money. Again, as a business model, don't do what we did because, you know, we were like, okay, we're not going to take sponsorship because how do you do a medical podcast and maintain independence? You know? So we rely entirely on our patrons, via Patreon, and they're very, very generous. And we have I think we have a good following. Of course, you'd always want it to be bigger to become self-supporting. And I mean, it would be great if this could be our full-time job, but it, obviously can't. But we do it. And I think we have an interesting podcast because I truly believe we are the only medical comedy podcast that features a teddy bear. I don't think any other podcast can make that claim.
Does your teddy bear have a name? I don't think.
Yeah, Teddy.
It's
Teddy.
just Teddy.
He's an integral part of the podcast. He is a recurring character. So for people who have never heard the podcast before, it is not the traditional podcast. So, you know, you're usually used to podcasts have certain types of formats. They're usually either interview podcasts or there's something like, you know, This American Life, which is segments. Ours is very different. It really is Jonathan and I bantering. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of jokes. There's a lot of humor. There's skits. We have a little bit of a
songs.
We have some. So, and we're always sort of tweaking it. So, I mean, by the time this comes out, maybe we'll have decided to change the format. Who knows? But we try to do something a little bit different. And so when you go into this, it's not just going to be a straight recitation of medical facts. We try to spice it up a little bit. And so there's a little bit of humor and there's some jokes as well.
Well, and that kind of leads me quite nicely into your book, because your book is not your traditional science book that goes through why the headlines are bad, etc., or why p-hacking occurs, or the many things that you tackle. You tackled it as a fictional story that intertwines the science methodology and the pitfalls. Is there a reason that you chose that format?
Well, if you listen to the podcast, I think you will see where a lot of the inspiration comes from. The reality is this book had a few different iterations. When I first wrote up the prospectus, it was a fairly traditional science communication book. You know, first chapter I wrote as a sample chapter was the one on coffee.
Oh, okay.
And whether there's a cancer link between coffee and cancer. And so I wrote it out and I was exploring all these issues, and a lot of the analogies are still there. So if you read the chapter, you see that I talk about selection bias, which is a common epidemiological concept, and I explain why it can skew things, and I give examples. So a lot of the content was the same, but it was written as a straight science book. And so I eventually got an agent. The agent pitched it to the publisher. Publisher got in touch with me directly. We had a conversation and he was like, it's good, but is there a way to sort of change it to make it better? And we bounced around a few different ideas, and he eventually raised a book that some listeners may be familiar with. It's called The Wealthy Barber.
Yes.
Yeah. So Wealthy Barber, I suspect it's more popular in Canada than in the US, but there might be American people who know it as well. The Wealthy Barber was a book about finance. Mm-hmm. And it used this type of structure where people were coming into a barber shop and the barber would talk to them about investment and estate planning and stuff like that. So it was a way of using dialogue to advance a core message. And so he raised that idea and I said, well, I do a podcast with my friend Jonathan, which is two people talking. Maybe we could do that. And he said, all right, develop it and let's see where it goes. And so I really sort of did it in that way. There are other historical examples. If you've never heard of The Wealthy Barber, think of the Socratic dialogues where, Socrates is talking with people and he uses the characters in the thing to sort of advance the arguments. And so my original thought was, okay, I'll do it that way. It's basically going to be call and answer.
Right.
And so I rewrote the coffee chapter in that way, with the doctor going into a coffee shop, meeting a barista and having this conversation. And I'd initially thought that I was going to keep that structure for the whole book. I basically just going to have two characters in the book talking. So basically almost exactly like Socrates. And the publisher was like, well, maybe you should change it up a bit just to give people some variety. And I was like, well, I don't really want to make this about the story, right? I don't want to take away from the science. But I said, okay, I'll change it up a bit. And then I was sort of like tinkering with the idea. And then I showed that chapter to a friend of mine. And I said, what do you think? And her response was, open quotes, pretty good, but I kept expecting him to ask her out at the end, close quotes. And the minute she said that, I was like, oh God, this is a romantic comedy. And so I reworked that chapter and reworked a lot of the narrative to actually have a story arc. And so when I submitted it, the first comment I got back from the editor was like, I wasn't expecting there to be character growth in this, but there is.
Yeah, there definitely is. And you get a bit attached to the characters.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to just spoil one thing. It's not really a spoiler, but actually I listened to it and read it. I have a book, an actual copy. So if you do listen to it, the person who reads it on Audible is very good, I thought. And I liked having the physical copy because there's charts and there's comics, there's some comedic elements, and you don't get that if you're listening to it. So it's nice to have both. So I'm going to plug both of them. I got through to the end and I went, what's the protagonist's name?
Yeah.
And I flipped through the whole thing to going, did I miss it? So just a warning to all of you who are going to read the book, you never find out his name.
You never find out his name. And that was an interesting little sort of quirk on my part. I mean, there were a few reasons for it. I kind of wanted to see if I could do it.
Yeah.
I was tempted at one point to reveal it just right at the end. And then I didn't. I kind of liked the idea that he had no name, that he was anonymous. I think there was maybe a passing reference to like Doctor Who in there a little bit as well, even though I've never really been a big Doctor Who fan. But I thought that the fact that you have this nameless narrator.
It's awesome. It made me go back through, right? It made me look again. So it's actually quite clever.
It sort of also originated from an observation. That is true if you ever write dialogue. And I got this feedback. I got a lot of great feedback from the editors, actually. So anybody who ever writes a book, if you decide to, really sacrifice a year of your life for something that's not going to make you a lot of money, really listen to the feedback of your editor, because they really did make the book better. And they taught me a lot about how to write dialogue. An important point I learned is like good dialogue doesn't sound natural. It's crafted, right? Watch TV. Nobody ever says hello, right? They just pick up the phone and they start talking. And it's because there's an economy of time and pacing and you have to do it that way. And nobody says names. Like in real life, you might be like, hi, Chris. Hi, Adrienne. How's it going? Yeah. You don't write that in dialogue. That's very, very boring. You never say your own name when you're talking. And people who know you don't tend to say your name. So I thought, it's like, if you're going to actually have proper dialogue, you don't tend to say names out loud. And if you're writing it from a first person narrative, you would never actually hear the name of the narrator. So I thought it was interesting to sort of try that. And so that's my little sort of quirk in the book.
Yeah, it was good. And it took me by surprise, as I say. How did you decide on the 8 things you were going to write about?
So the way you write a book, for people who want to know, is, if you're going to go via the traditional pathway of getting an agent and a publisher, you need to have the book more or less mapped out. And so I started off with, I think, 10 original ideas, and I wanted each chapter to be on an epidemiological concept. This is a book about epidemiology, which is so boring, nobody would buy it. So I'm like, okay, we're going to make it about food, to make it more interesting for people, because everybody cares about food. And then we're going to throw in the romance aspect of it and all that. So each chapter was going to be about a specific point in epidemiology. So if you're reading it from the science perspective, every chapter is going to have a lesson that you can then use to apply for future. So the first chapter, which is about vitamin C, is also going to teach you about the dangers of subgroup analysis and p-hacking. Mm-hmm. When we talk about red meat and we're talking about the cancer potential of eating red meat, and IARC and all that, you're going to learn about the differences between hazard and risk. I had sort of mapped out the key epidemiological concepts that I wanted to tackle, and I came out with about 10 of them, and I tried to make them all food related. We can quibble about whether the vitamin C and vitamin D chapter are really food-based or not, but I thought I could permit myself a certain literary license there. I put stuff in, I'd taken stuff out. I was going to do a chapter on fish oils instead of vitamin D. But then at the end, the vitamin D stuff just flowed better. And a lot of it ended up being driven by the narrative, shockingly enough.
Interesting.
Because I needed the characters to hit certain points.
Yeah.
When you're at the airport, I thought, oh, what happens when you're at the airport? People are sick, vitamin C. Okay, that works. And then you're on a plane. Well, if you're on a plane, you're talking about food. It's got to be the meal that's in front of you. So maybe it should be the meat versus not. Mm-hmm. And then you're like, well, if you're going out with your friends, then it should be about the wine that you're having at dinner. And so a lot of the chapters, strangely enough, ended up being driven by the demands of the narrative story structure, which is why the fish oil stuff didn't actually fit. And so I ended up jettisoning it. And at that point, the book was getting very long. Every time I finished a chapter, I would send it into the publisher for them to review. And they were like, okay, good. You're going to be finishing the book soon, right? Because you don't want to turn this into War and Peace. So by the time we had gotten to sort of December of whenever I submitted this, I think I submitted it 2022. Yeah, December 2022. We were beginning of December and they were like, so like one more chapter, right? And you'll be done by Christmas. And I was like, yeah, okay, fine. Yes. And so that truncated at 9, whereas I think my original plan was to do 10, but the book, right. I mean, the book is already like 300 pages. So like to make it much longer, I think would have been excessive.
And it's funny. It was one of my faster reads I've had this year. I finished it very quickly. I enjoyed it. And when it ended, I was actually disappointed. And I want to know what happened to those characters. Is there going to be a second book with the characters?
There is a treatise for a second book with the characters. Whether it sees the light of day, I think is largely going to depend on the sales.
Right.
I got some very good feedback from the publisher too. Like when I submitted it, he was like pretty good, sort of as a joke, like start thinking as a sequel. Maybe it could be a marriage ceremony with Rufus and as a groomsman. Rufus is a dog, by the way. So there were sort of like jokes about, what we could do. And I said, well, listen, I can actually work on something. And they said, okay, well, go ahead. So I wrote a sample chapter for a potential sequel on aspartame.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. So I thought, and that was just when, the WHO had done their thing. So it was very timely.
Yes.
And so it was, the feedback was like, okay, it's good, but we have to see how it sells because at the end, as much as we may not want to admit it, this is a business, right? And so if a publisher thinks a book will sell well and make money, they will put money behind it. And of course, the more sales there are, the more advertising they put into it. I mean, this is the real difficult part about writing a book, especially when you're a first time author. You got to get the word out. And that is where the greatest hustle is because the days of a 20 city book tour, I think are largely behind us for the most part. So much of the marketing now is online. It's through interviews like this. And you really got to sort of hit that critical mass where people are like, okay, we can take this seriously and start putting effort behind it. Because the reality is, most books do not sell well, right? A lot of people write books.
That's right.
They're very niche. They go to the bookstore, they sit on the shelf. A year later, they're returned back to the publisher. But if you can generate enough of a genuine interest, and especially if you can get a second book, now people are like, okay, this is serious. People will actually answer your calls at this point and sort of start to give you the time of day.
Well, I sure hope you get a second book. And I'm just going to go back a little bit to something just because I'm a math teacher. That's my former life. One of my favorite things that you tackled was how you can have true statistics and they're actually correct.
Yeah.
However, they can be extremely misleading based on how you use them. And you used the lottery ticket analogy, which I thought was brilliant. Your chances of winning the lottery are 1 in 14 million. If you buy 2 tickets, you double your chances.
Yeah. It's still a very small risk. It's still a very small risk.
It's exactly. It's very unlikely you're going to win still. And I think that's a really important one to get across to people because there's so much fear in health products.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, and completely understandably. But I mean, the problem is that there's a lot of fear in health because, I mean, obviously nobody wants to get sick, but the statistics involved are sometimes a little bit counterintuitive and they don't mean what we think they mean. And it's not a question of having an advanced math degree. And sometimes the math itself is not that complicated. It's just that you have to understand the actual definitions. And people who don't know because they have no training for it, and journalists who have no training in science, so I think for the general public, I think they're sometimes a little bit thrown, like, why is there so much subtlety and subjectivity to statistical research? And that's, I think, a point that's hard to sort of get across sometimes, is like a lot of times statistical research is subjective.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is the issue also, just to tease something from the book. This is the issue that we get into with red wine research. And why does it look as if red wine is protective? Well, it really makes a difference how you categorize the people who drink zero alcohol. Are they never drinkers or are they former drinkers? And if you think like, who cares? Well, that's where you start to get into issues. So it's these little tiny things that I think when you hear them for the first time, we're like, wow, that's actually kind of fascinating. And to a certain extent, also a little bit worrying because a simple decision made almost on the fly can have a dramatic impact in, whether your study shows a benefit or shows a harm.
Exactly. I do think that these varying headlines that we get, 1 minute, coffee causes cancer, the next minute, coffee cures everything.
Yeah.
Because another study has come out. And that, I think, leads to the distrust of science and studies. And people I guess they can start cherry picking the ones they want to believe, or they can just distrust everything. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's definitely a lot of truth to that. I think once you get into a situation where you just have these sort of conflicting headlines from one day to the next, eventually people just tune it out, right? And, in some respects, maybe that's a good thing because a lot of this research doesn't quite rise to the level where it really should permeate the public consciousness. I mean, a lot of this research should be seen as very preliminary and hypothesis generating. You'd be like, okay, that's interesting, but shouldn't change anything. Where it becomes problematic is when you get something like the French paradox, like the idea that red wine is good for you, and it just hits at the right moment on the right venue, like it did on that 60-minute story with Morley Safer, and then it just explodes. And then you really can't get away from it almost 40 years after the fact. It was funny. I was doing something for local television here in Montreal in French. They wanted to have a debate between two cardiologists about is red wine good for you or not? And I was like, really? We're still talking about this? But yeah, there are people, and there are even some cardiologists that are still like, no, red wine is good for you. It prevents heart attacks. And you're like, but no, but really no, like we know it's bad for you. And then what was really funny that at the end of that TV segment, even the pro-wine cardiologist, when they asked him pointedly, he's like, what do you tell your patients? Like, well, I do tell them to reduce alcohol because it's actually not good for you in terms of the sugar and the blood pressure and all that. And they were like, so why? How are you on the pro wine side? And, again, it's very fascinating to watch people, even, very intelligent people, like, they have these biases and they're like, no, red wine is good for you. Although I guess it like increases your risk of diabetes, causes weight gain, increases your blood pressure, and is bad for your health overall. But still, it's cardioprotective. I'm like, how is it cardioprotective? It's doing everything terrible for your generalized health. And I mean, again, it's not to say that you can't drink wine. I mean, I'm drunk right now. I'm kidding. I'm not. But you can certainly drink alcohol. Where I think it's dangerous is to convince yourself that it's good for you and see it not as a treat, but as health food, which it's not. And this health food label is being applied to a lot of different foods. Now we're seeing it with chocolate, periodically touted as a health food, even though it's really just loaded with sugar and fat.
Especially dark chocolate.
Yeah, dark chocolate. I mean, people are talking about it as if it's vegetables. I mean, it's not. And even dark chocolate is not healthy for you. It's really interesting to see how people can sort of use this uncertainty in the scientific literature to sort of really hype a particular position they have, whether it's economics. A lot of this is being promoted by lobby groups, right? So like there's a lot of lobby groups for chocolate, a lot of lobby groups for alcohol. But then you also get into stuff like, low carb, high fat or low fat, high carb. Like what's better? And you have these people fighting it out and like, you realize both of these are bad for you and that you should just eat it's really surprising how entrenched a lot of people can become in these opinions where you sort of ask them like, well, take a step back with me. Do you realize that there's no conclusive evidence one way or the other because it's frankly impossible to do randomized trials in most circumstances, which is a point that I mentioned in the book as well, with the one exception of chocolate where we actually did do a randomized trial on chocolate. It did nothing, but it hasn't made the myth go away. People are like, well, there's still health benefits to chocolate. No, but we did. It was called Cosmos. It was supposed to be the definitive study to settle the issue of whether there were health benefits to chocolate. It happened. It got published. No one cared.
Well, I think that's a great way to end here. And thank you so much for joining me Can you tell us where people can find your work? And I know Richard will be sure to include the information in the show notes.
Yeah. So go to a place where they sell books and you can buy this. And if they don't have it in stock, make a nuisance of yourself and refuse to leave until they get it.
I love it.
No. So if you go to any bookstore, Chapters Indigo store, I mean, it's there. It should be in most stores. You can go to any bookstore. If you feel like the big chains have too much money, you can go to a local independent bookstore. They'll probably have it there as well. And, you can order it on Amazon, or you can even order it directly from the publisher at www.doescoffeecausecancer.com. But it comes to the same thing. Just go buy the book, buy 10 copies for your friends because it makes a great Christmas gift. And then when you go to the bookstore, demand that they have an in-person signing event so that I can come there and, sign the books and say hi to you in person. If you want to hear what the book is like, I mean, there is the audiobook version, but then Jonathan and I, and a special mystery guest, read chapter 2 of the book like an old time radio play. So you can listen to that. It's our most recent podcast episode. If you go check out the podcast, which is, bodyofevidence.ca.
Awesome. And you write regularly for the McGill Office of Science and Society.
Oh, yeah. All the other stuff. So you can go to the McGill Office of Science and Society. Also write for the Montreal Gazette. I have a regular radio segment with CGAD. So you can go to cgad.com or via the iHeartRadio app and you can get it that way. And then my regular TV segments are CTV Montreal. That's every Wednesday, but you can find it online. CBC News Network every Mondays, but they don't always post those online. So those are hard to, if you don't watch them live. And, I'm usually sort of doing ad hoc things. I do one Greek language program. If anybody who speaks Greek, you can watch me on Odyssey TV in Canada, and they replay that like several times during the week. So I do my medical segments in Greek as well, if anyone's really interested in learning. Yeah.
So where does the interest in Greek come from?
That's my answers. That's where my parents are from.
Ah.
Yeah. I was born here in Montreal, but my parents were born in Greece. And so I learned Greek. And so this also became a big issue during the pandemic, which is, you really got to get into community groups because there are these echo chambers that exist. And a lot of people in cultural communities who don't speak English or English and French, if you're here in Montreal, they just watch foreign language programming from somewhere and they don't consume regular media. And so I had one person come up to me once on the street and they were like, why do all the doctors say the COVID vaccines are dangerous, but you're the only one saying it's good? And that was because this person was just consuming all these sort of alternative facts, news sources from, I guess, Greece, I imagine.
Wow.
And I was the only voice that penetrated that little echo chamber. So I do a segment for the Greek television program, and you're targeting, an older generation of people who probably wouldn't watch the news and just don't really know what's going on because they don't watch CBC or CTV or any of the Canadian news stations.
Right. Very important work.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, this is Adrienne Hill from Skookum Studios.